The fourth lesson looks at the causes, course, and consequence of the Iran-Iraq War, which lasted between 1980 and 1988. Interestingly, though, this is a good trivia question. What was the longest conventional war of the 20th century? That was, in fact, the 8-year-long Iran-Iraq War, as long as World War II, World War I, or any of the other wars in between. There were longer conflicts, but not that evolved into full-out war, such as Vietnam actually lasted a little bit longer, but it wasn't in a state of full-out war between the United States and the North Vietnamese. You saw in the Vietnam War, if you recall, for instance, the sort of escalation and de-escalation of conflict, where they weren't actually totally fighting a proper war. This was your proper conventional war with ground forces and tanks engaged in constant combat, like, for example, World War II had been for a period of 8 years. So what is the background to all of this conflict, this terrible, terrible war? Iraq invades Iran from both the land and the air in September of 1980. What you could probably say about this war is that it was long, bloody, and pointless. The causes are a combination of long-term factors and more immediate considerations after the fall of the Shah in Iran. Most claim Saddam was the aggressor. He did, in fact, after all, invade Iran in September 1980. But it can also easily be argued that Saddam invaded as a sort of preemptive strike, that it was pretty much looking like Iran would have invaded Iraq, or something would have happened along that border due to Iran in the years leading up to the Iran-Iraq War. So you can argue that Saddam wasn't totally the naked aggressor. Nevertheless, he is the person who fires the first shots. The first reason for the Iran-Iraq War is territorial disputes. Iran and Iraq share a 1,400-kilometer border, as you saw in the last map that runs up from the Persian Gulf directly north. The border at the southern end is where the two areas in dispute are. The first area of dispute is over the Shatt al-Arab waterway. This connects Iran and Iraqi cities to the Persian Gulf. Iraq is actually only connected to the Persian Gulf really via this waterway. The Iraqi city of Basra is the major port in Iraq for the export, for instance, of Iraqi oil via tanker into the Persian Gulf and then to markets in the United States, Europe, wherever it happens to be. This waterway, therefore, is pretty important to Iraq. Iran does have a longer coastline on the Persian Gulf, but nevertheless, it has two important cities on its border. The Iranians and the Iraqis have been arguing over who had the rights to sail up and down the Shatt al-Arab waterway, which leads into the Persian Gulf, ever since, well, really since the 16th century. In 1937, a treaty is signed, and this treaty is overwhelmingly favorable to Iraq. It actually sets the dividing line between the two countries, not down the middle of the river, but just at the shallow water mark. So just as the water starts to get very shallow approaching the shore on the Iranian side of the border, which means that the Iraqis have almost total control. And in fact, the Iranians, in order to use that waterway, had to pay tolls to the Iraqis. The second was the southwestern province of Iran, which is known as Khuzestan. And it is an oil-rich area. Not only that, it's populated with a non-Persian population. It's populated mostly by Arabs who had strong cultural and family ties to Iraqis before Iraq and Iran were divided into two separate countries. Saddam claimed, therefore, a historical right to control the province and encouraged the Arabs there to revolt. Ironically, that had the actual impact of having the Iranians retaliating by encouraging the Kurds in northern Iraq to revolt against Saddam. So in many ways, these two countries start pushing each other over territorial issues. Here's an example, or here's an idea of what the Shatt al-Arab waterway looks like. You see how it sort of empties out into the Gulf, and the Iraqi major city of Basra, which is located close to its oil fields, is right here. And from Basra, most of the tankers come in and out and then empty out into the Gulf. What happens that sort of meant to resolve this dispute is something known as the Algiers Agreement. Okay, this was an agreement between Iraq and Iran, signed in the mid-1970s, that sort of, I guess, gave equal rights to this waterway. Saddam realized in the 1970s that he couldn't win a war against Iran. You'll recall that Iran under the Shah had the fifth largest army in the world. And Saddam, though he had a powerful army, did not have an army capable of challenging the Iranians at this particular time. Therefore, he makes what's known as a tactical retreat. And the tactical retreat is when you sort of give ground in a negotiation or give ground in a war, only to establish yourself in a better position later on. And what he does is he considers his signing of the Algiers Agreement a tactical retreat. The Algiers Agreement states that Iran would cease to support Kurdish separatists, a win for Saddam, but Iraq would also drop its claims to Khuzestan, a loss for Saddam, and a win for the Iranians. The border between the Iraq and Iran down the Shatt al-Arab waterway would go down the middle, or the deep water mark, and this meant that both countries could equally share the straits. Saddam regarded this as a setback, but was determined eventually to gain the lost ground at the first opportunity. And shortly before invading Iran in 1980, he renounced the Algiers Agreement as sort of a precursor to war. The second reason is the notion of the domination of the Gulf. The Persian Gulf region is, of course, the most essential region for those Arabs, for the Arabs and the Persians who live there. In 1980, Iran and Iraq were realistically the only serious contenders for the leadership of the region, as they had the military and financial resources. The Emirates and the Saudi Arabians, for instance, weren't necessarily as developed as either the Iranians or the Iraqis. In addition to that, Saddam hoped that by taking the Shatt al-Arab waterway in Khuzestan, he could expand the Iraqis' oil reserves at the expense of Iran and make Iraq more important and by extension, more financially powerful than the Iranians. And he also saw an opportunity to really set Iraq up to be the dominant power in the Arab world. In 1945, something was set up known as the Arab League, and the Arab League was established to promote the political, economic, and cultural interests of Arab countries. The founding members of the Arab League include Iraq, of course, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Syria. These countries gang up on the Egyptians, who signed a peace accord with Israel in 1979, and as a result, they expel Egypt from the Arab League. So what you have then is the most important Arab country being kicked out of the Arab League over its relations with Israel, and Saddam sees an opportunity to fill the void as the leader and most powerful country in the Arab League by invading Iran and taking some of its territory. There's also an opportunity provided by the Islamic Revolution. Obviously, the overthrow of the Shah ended a decades-long alliance with the most powerful country in the world, the United States, and this meant that the Iranian army was deprived of American parts for its tanks and planes, equipment. It was deprived of American artillery shells, weapons, what have you. There is a massive opportunity for Iraq to seize upon the instability in Iraq here. Not only that, the Ayatollah purged the Iranian military leadership who had been loyal to the Shah and replaced them with inexperienced Muslim clerics in some cases who didn't have a real sense of how to operate a modern military. And this gave Saddam a unique ability to strike, and in his eyes, a delay would only give Iran time to recover. The last reason is that Ayatollah Khomeini, of course, had opposed Saddam Hussein. There are religious issues between the states. Iran is now a Shiite Muslim Islamic republic governed by Muslim Sharia law. Iraq, on the other hand, is a secular state led by a man who is ostensibly a Sunni Muslim but not very religious, and most of the leaders themselves of Iraq are the Ba'ath Party people who are Sunni Muslims. Khomeini then regards Iraq with contempt and begins appealing to the Shiites and the religious people in Iraq to overthrow Saddam and to establish an Islamic Republic in Iraq. And of course, this religious aggression towards Iraq really riles Saddam. And in 1979 and 1980, to boot, anti-Ba'ath Party riots break out in Shiite areas of Iraq, and Saddam becomes convinced that these are due to Khomeini's involvement. So there's an essence here that he wants to punish the Ayatollah for his destabilization of the Iraqi government. Additionally, he starts to believe, and probably correctly, that eventually Iran would turn on Iraq and use its military force to establish an Islamic Republic in Iraq. So in many ways, his attack was the best form of defense. So to protect himself, he was going to attack. You get the point. I'm not going to go into the major details of the war. What you broadly need to know was that it was a stalemate. Not a heck of a lot happens. If you go back to the first map I showed you here and you flip back through your notes, you'll see that the fighting takes place along the border, and there's not a lot of ground gained by either side. Iraqi forces invade in September 1980, and there's little resistance, but within a month, they're stopped in the middle of the Iranian desert, and they resorted to firing missiles at Iran cities. And this was known as the War of the Cities. Both sides bombed and killed thousands of civilians. There were chemical attacks in this war. The Iraqis had superior firepower, but Iran sent thousands of new recruits in what they called human waves, effectively running at Iraqi machine guns to overwhelm them. Within 2 years, Iran had recaptured most of the land it lost, and Iraq had been cut off from its only seaports via the Shadow Waterway. By 1984, the two sides were bogged down in trench warfare along the 1,000-mile border, and it really, in many ways, just is a replication of World War I from that point. You also have, as a feature of this war, massive foreign involvement. Most of the Arab states supported Iraq. They opposed the spreading of Iran's Shiite revolution because it looked at risk destabilizing the regimes in their own country, which, although Muslim in many cases, were also dictatorships or monarchies in their own right, who would be undermined by the rule of a Muslim clerics, as was the case in Iran. A lot of them also feared that the Shiite revolution in Iran would pose a threat to their oil. Of course, the Iranians had cut off foreign oil, especially to the United States, and as a result, other countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan, and smaller Gulf states will supply money and arms to Iraq to return a sense of normalcy to the Gulf. Syria will support Iran because of its rivalry with Iraq, especially over the areas of Kurdistan, which in some cases Syria claimed. France, Germany, and the USA and the USSR will side with Iraq. America is, of course, more terrified of Iran controlling the oil than anything else. They did not support the United States, either leader, it's important to note, but feared Saddam less than Khomeini. And they feared Saddam less than Khomeini because, number one, a nationalistic Islamic State would cut supplies of oil. Iran had already cut the U.S. off, and losing Iraqi oil would be catastrophic to the American economy. In reality, they didn't want either side to win, and they would like a return to the status quo, but didn't want Saddam to lose more than they wanted anything else. Okay, so their strategy was to provide him with just enough support as not to lose. One of the key supports was something called the War of the Tankers in May 1984. Both sides attacked each other's oil tankers and merchant ships, and the U.S. will send its Navy into the Gulf to protect the oil supplies. And in fact, during the War of the Tankers, will attack Iranian oil installations and Iranian gunboats to support the Iraqi cause. At the end of the war, largely due to the assistance the Iraqis had from the Westerners, which gave them a clear advantage, they are in a position to be stronger. Iraq's superiority in military equipment will eventually lead Khomeini to agreeing to a ceasefire in August 1988. In July of 1988, Iran finally accepts the terms of the ceasefire, which was eventually, as I said, signed in August. The country is a mess. It's estimated that nearly 1 million Iranians and 500,000 Iraqis had died. There was brutality on both sides. Khomeini said that he found agreeing to the ceasefire more deadly than taking poison, and he died in 1989. Millions filled the streets of Tehran for his funeral. Iraq's economy had suffered extensive damage and was in tatters. There was some opposition to Saddam, coordinated through the mosques and army, and the army wouldn't dare attack the mosques. So Iraq doesn't come out of this very well. I'll elaborate on that in a second. Between 88 and 90, there were attempts to overthrow Saddam, and many officers were executed for conspiracy. So let's break it down into political, economic, social, etc., and then, of course, the consequences for Saddam. The first consequence of the Iran-Iraq war is a political one. There's no clear winner produced by this war. Neither country, Iran or Iraq, achieved their war aims. Saddam never got the territory he demanded. The Iranians never overthrew the Sunni Ba'ath Party, and established an Islamic Republic in Iraq. The border was unchanged. The pre-war status quo, if you will, was restored. Saddam didn't receive the long-term support of the West either, and in fact, by 1991, would be at war in the Gulf against the Western powers. So the support he got in the Iran-Iraq war was only fleeting. It was only insofar as it prevented him from not losing and then dried up the minute the war ended. The social consequences are pretty dire. When you talk about casualties, Iran lost 1 million men of its 50 million population. Iraq lost 500,000 of a population of 17 million, which equates to pretty equally 2% of their populations, respectively. Many more. Of course, these numbers don't take into account those who were seriously wounded, psychologically damaged at the end of this conflict. And so the conflict had relatively dramatic social consequences. It does lead, as was alluded to earlier, especially in the mosques, against some organized protest against Saddam. The economic consequences of this war are considerable. Iraq was transformed from one of the richest countries in the world to a state that was totally bankrupt. Iraq owed $80 billion in foreign debt. Its oil revenues were halved due to the bombing and war damage because of the destruction of its oil wells, etc., etc. Therefore, the Iraqis have to go from being a country that was being modernized, Saddam was lavishing them with gifts and improvements in their life, to one that has to suffer severe austerity in the late 1980s, early 1990s. On the other hand, Iran incurred similar foreign debt, almost exactly $80 billion as well. They also faced bankruptcy. Iranian oil revenue was halved to 10 billion. Iranian living standards plummet, and they don't really recoup actually for about 15 or 20 years. So the Iranians go from having the Shah, and their living standards weren't great, but there were some improvements, to having the Ayatollah going through a terrible war, which cost them a considerable amount of casualties, and then having their living standards plummet to levels below the Shah, but now being completely engulfed in an Islamic revolution, in an Islamic state that they can't seem to get out of. So the consequences of this war were absolutely dire, and the war ultimately wasn't worth fighting on either side. Nevertheless, for Saddam, he claims victory, and despite the obvious futility and the obvious fact he didn't win, he does claim victory. He says that he claims victory because he had halted the spread of the Islamic Revolution, and he had prevented Ayatollah Khomeini from toppling his regime. So in a sense, you can argue that Saddam triumphed because he survived. He did realize that Iraq people wouldn't be bought off for long. He realized that they would need real and tangible victories to get behind, or else the rebellions that were growing, especially in the Shiite mosques in the south, would get out of control. So Saddam, as a precursor to our next lesson, would need to find a new way to increase the wealth of his country, would need to find a new country to capture, and a new way to let his people know that he is truly their gift, okay, the greatest and most powerful leader Iraq has ever seen. And to do so, he will invade Kuwait.